Honestly, you're making everyone uncomfortable. You always do this.
Do what exactly?
Make everything about you. Pull the energy down. It would be better if you just, stepped outside for a bit.
Nicole.
I'm serious. Go. We'll all have a better time.
I think you should be careful about who you're asking to leave.
It's just a party, Ethan. It's not your house.
She said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. It's not your house. She said it at a table surrounded by his family in a room his father had built 40 years ago in a home that carried the Calloway name on every document in the county recorder's office. She said it to dismiss him, to embarrass him, to establish in front of the people who had known him his entire life that she was the one who decided who stayed and who left. What Nicole didn't know, standing there waiting for him to walk out that door, was that she had just made the last mistake she'd get to make in that house. If this kind of story is your thing, subscribe. You're going to want to be here for what happens next. She said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. It's not your house. I've been thinking about that sentence since the moment she said it, turning it over the way you turn over something you picked up from the ground and aren't sure what it is yet. Because in one narrow sense, she was right. My name isn't on the deed. My father's name is on the deed. But the house is built on land my grandfather purchased with money my grandfather earned, and the understanding in our family has always been that the house belongs to the Calloways, the way certain things belong to certain families, not through a document you can point to, but through the accumulated weight of who built it and why and for whom. Nicole didn't know any of that when she said it. That's the part I keep returning to. I should explain what kind of party this was. My father, Victor Calloway, turned 70 that week, and the dinner was the family's way of marking it. Not a large event, not catered. Just the people who had always gathered in that house, my aunt and uncle from Portland. 2 cousins who'd driven in from outside the city, my sister Lydia and her husband, a family friend named Walter, who had known my father since before I was born. 12 people around a table that had seated some version of this same group for most of my life. I had grown up at that table. I had done homework at it, argued at it, sat across from my mother at it on the morning of her diagnosis, and on the morning after she died. The table was old enough that the finish had worn off one corner where I used to rest my elbow as a kid, and my father had never refinished it because my mother said the worn spot was her favorite thing about the room. Nicole thought it needed to be replaced. She had mentioned it twice. I'm not going to spend too long on what Nicole was like when I met her, because the version of her I fell for is not the version that's relevant to this story. But I'll say this much because it matters to understand how the evening ended. There was a time when she was genuinely curious about my family. Not performing curiosity, actually curious. The first time I brought her to the house about 1.5 years before we got married, she spent 40 minutes talking to my father about the property, asking questions about when it was built, what the neighborhood had looked like in the early years, what he remembered about moving in. He had liked her for that. My mother had been alive then, and she had liked her too. What changed, I think, is harder to say as a single thing. It was more like a drift slow enough that I could convince myself it wasn't happening for longer than I should have. She started mentioning more often than felt natural what our friends had and what we didn't. She started treating my work. I'm an architect with a practice I'd spent 8 years building as something to be explained rather than described the way you explain a hobby that hasn't produced anything yet. She started referring to the house when she mentioned it to her friends as the family's place in the country, a phrase that turned something real into something decorative. I noticed. I didn't say anything for reasons that were reasonable at the time and that I've revisited since. The dinner was a Thursday evening in October. The table had been set by my aunt using the same china my grandmother had brought to the house 50 years ago. Walter had brought wine. Lydia had made the dessert my father always requested for his birthday, a particular kind of apple cake that she was the only person still alive who knew how to make the way he liked it. It was for most of the evening exactly what it was supposed to be. Nicole had arrived with me, but had quickly moved to operate as though she were hosting, arranging seating in a way that hadn't been planned, redirecting conversations toward topics she found more interesting, offering opinions on the house's decor at a volume that the room couldn't ignore. None of it was egregious enough to name in the moment. It was the kind of behavior that wears down a room gradually the way weather wears down stone. My father noticed it. Lydia noticed it. I noticed it and said nothing, which I know now was its own kind of choice. The moment that matters came partway through dinner after I said something about my mother. We had been talking about one of her habits, the way she used to insist on a specific napkin folding style that none of the rest of us could replicate, and how we all still tried anyway. And I was mid-sentence when Nicole said pleasantly but clearly that perhaps we should keep the mood upbeat. She said she wanted to make sure the evening stayed celebratory. The table went quiet for a moment. My aunt looked at her plate. Walter took a slow drink of his wine. I finished my sentence. My father acknowledged it with a nod. The conversation moved on. But Nicole wasn't finished. When I got up to help bring something in from the kitchen, she said something to the table that I heard from the next room. Something about how I had difficulty in large social settings, how it was something she was working on with me, how they should just give me a little grace. She said it in the voice of someone offering context that has been asked for, though no one had asked. When I came back in the room, had the atmosphere of people who have just heard something they aren't sure how to respond to and are waiting to see what happens next. Nicole looked at me with the expression of someone who has arranged something and is waiting to see if it lands. Then she said it. She said I was making everyone uncomfortable, that I had been doing it all evening, that I didn't read rooms well, and everyone in the room knew it. She said it at full volume with 12 people listening. Then she said it would probably be better for everyone if I stepped outside for a bit. And then she said, "It's not your house." I want to describe what the room looked like in the 5 seconds after she said that. My aunt's hand had stopped moving. She was holding a fork and she didn't put it down and she didn't raise it. She simply held it in the air while her face did the work of processing what she had just heard. My cousin on the left side of the table had turned slightly toward the door in the way people turn when they're instinctively looking for an exit from an uncomfortable situation. Walter set down his wine glass with deliberate care and looked at the far wall, the expression of a man who has decided not to say the thing that is immediately available to him. Lydia was looking at me. My father was looking at Nicole. Not with anger. My father doesn't express anger quickly. He was looking at her with the stillness of someone who has been patient for a long time and has arrived at the limit of it. I stood up. Nicole's expression shifted into something satisfied. She gestured slightly toward the door. I looked at the room instead, at my father, at Lydia, at the 12 people who had known me my whole life gathered in the house where I had grown up around the table my mother had sat at for 40 years. I said, "I think you should be careful about who you're asking to leave." Nicole made a small sound that was almost a laugh, the kind designed to minimize what someone just said. She told me it was just a party. She said I was being dramatic. My father spoke then. He said, "Nicole." And then he said, "Perhaps this is the right time." She looked at him. She didn't understand the sentence. I should explain the timeline here because it matters. My grandfather, Edward Calloway, had structured his will with a specific provision. None of his direct heirs were to disclose the extent of the estate to a romantic partner until the relationship had been continuous for a minimum of 3 years. The 3-year window was triggered by the marriage date, not by any calendar milestone. Ethan and Nicole had been married for 2 years and 9 months, 3 months short. My father's 70th birthday was the date he had long planned to formalize the disclosure with the extended family as witnesses, which the trust documents permitted him to do at a family gathering of his choosing, provided the designated heir was present and consenting. The birthday was the occasion he had chosen, and it happened to fall within the disclosure window. In 3 months, I would have told Nicole myself on the actual 3-year date. Tonight was my father telling the family, which was different, and which the situation in front of him had made feel necessary. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a small envelope on the table. He said, "I've been waiting for the right moment to share some news with the family. It seems this is the evening." My father doesn't tell stories the way most people tell stories. He doesn't build to the point. He starts at the point and works outward, filling in the context after the essential fact has been established, so that by the time you understand why the fact matters, you've already absorbed it. It's a quality that made him a good businessman and an occasionally frustrating father, and it's the quality that shaped how he delivered the information that changed the evening. He said my father left a significant estate. He said it in the same tone you'd use to say the weather was supposed to change, not dramatic, just factual. Then he said that the estate had been held in trust pending the completion of a 3-year confidentiality window in each of his grandchildren's marriages, and that tonight, given the assembled family and his own planned formalization of the disclosure, was the appropriate moment to communicate the terms to the household. He looked at Nicole when he said household. She was smiling in the way people smile when they're trying to follow a conversation they haven't caught up to yet. Her expression was calibrated for polite interest, which told me she thought he was about to say something that would require an appropriate reaction from her, and she was preparing to provide one. He described the scale of the estate in the way the trust documents required, not as a dramatic number, but as a structured summary. Properties across 3 states, including several parcels in the region we were sitting in. Multiple holding entities. A management arrangement that had been operating for years, under names that were deliberately not attached to ours. And at the end of the summary, the part that shifted the air in the room, the primary assets, including the family home we were sitting in, would transfer formally to the trust's designated heir upon the filing of the required documentation. The designated heir was me. I watched Nicole's face during that part. I want to be as honest as I can about this because I've been asked since then whether I felt something satisfying in watching her understand, and the honest answer is yes for a moment, and then no. The yes was the human reaction to watching someone who had just publicly dismissed you be confronted with information they couldn't unhear. The no came almost immediately after because what I was watching wasn't triumph. It was the face of someone whose entire operating model had just been shown to be built on a false premise, and that's not a comfortable thing to witness even when the person earned it. Her smile didn't fall dramatically. It slowly emptied out like something draining until what was left on her face wasn't an expression at all, but the absence of one. The face of a person whose brain has overridden the social performance because there isn't enough remaining capacity to maintain both the calculation and the feeling simultaneously. The room was quiet. My aunt, who had been holding her fork in the air when Nicole told me to leave, finally set it down. Walter looked at his wine glass, then at Victor with the expression of a man who has been keeping something to himself for most of the evening, and is quietly satisfied that the evening has arrived at a truer version of itself. Lydia was looking at Nicole with the expression she gets when she's deciding not to say something she could say. My father folded the envelope and put it back in his pocket. He picked up his fork and continued eating as though the statement had been a routine item on a list he'd been working through. Nicole's adjustment began about 40 seconds after the room went quiet. I've thought a lot about those 40 seconds. She produced from somewhere a version of warmth, not the warmth she'd had in the early years, which had been natural enough to convince me, but a reconstructed warmth put together quickly from available materials. She reached across the table and touched my hand. She said that this was wonderful news, that she was so glad the family had finally shared it with her, that she hoped I knew how proud she was of everything I came from. She said finally shared it with her in the tone of someone establishing that she had been kept in the dark, which was true, while implying that she was owed the information, which was not. Lydia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. I didn't pull my hand away. I didn't respond to the warmth. I sat with her hand on mine, and I thought about the thing my father had said. Perhaps this is the right time, and about how much he had seen from the far end of the table that I had been too close to see clearly. What happened next is the part of the evening that people in the family still describe differently, depending on who you ask, because what happened was mostly small things rather than one large confrontation, and small things read differently depending on where you're standing. Nicole began talking to my aunt first, then to Walter, then to a cousin who had been quiet all evening. She was charming in the practiced way she could be charming, asking questions, showing interest, drawing people into conversation. But the room had a different quality now, and the charm was landing differently than it would have an hour earlier. People were responding politely and not being warmed. There was a transactional quality to the social exchange that Nicole was experienced enough to feel but couldn't quite identify the source of. What had changed was that the room knew something about me. It hadn't known before, and knowing it had reoriented everyone's relationship to the evening. Nicole mentioned at one point that she'd always thought the family home had such wonderful bones, and it was good to know it would stay in the right hands. She said it in a way meant to signal continuity and investment, that she was already thinking of herself as part of the stewardship. Walter glanced at my father when she said it. My father's expression didn't change. The guests left around 9:30. There were hugs at the door, the particular texture of a family evening ending people, finding their coats. Walter saying something to my father at the door that made the older man nod in a way that suggested the comment was accurate and appreciated. After the last car left, I helped my father carry dishes to the kitchen. Lydia was at the sink. Nicole said she was going to get some air and stepped out through the back. My father handed me a plate and said nothing. Lydia said without looking up she adjusted fast. I said she always does. My father handed me another plate. I dried it and set it on the stack, and I thought about what I'd been sitting with all evening. Not the announcement, not Nicole's face when she heard it, not the small theater of watching her recalibrate. I was thinking about the question I'd been avoiding for longer than I wanted to admit, whether I had kept the secret for the right reasons, or whether I had kept it partly because knowing the answer felt safer than asking the question. The trust had given me a reason to wait. My grandfather had believed, and I had believed him, that 3 years of a relationship conducted without knowledge of the estate was meaningful evidence about the relationship itself. That was true. But I also knew, standing at the sink in my father's kitchen, that I had been watching Nicole for 2 years and 9 months, and that what I had seen, the drift, the comparison, the way she said the family's place in the country to people who weren't family, had been visible for at least 18 of those months. I had a reason to wait. I had also been using the wait to avoid deciding what to do with what I could already see. Nicole came back in after about 10 minutes. She asked if she and I could talk. I said not tonight. I said it would be better to give everyone some space and come back to it when we were home. She accepted that, with the acceptance of someone who has realized the evening's terms have changed and doesn't yet have enough information to negotiate against the new ones. My father walked her to the door. I stayed in the kitchen. Lydia turned off the faucet and looked at me. She said, "You knew for a long time, didn't you? Not about tonight, about her." I didn't answer immediately. Then I said yes. She nodded and turned off the kitchen light and left me sitting at the table in the dark at the place where my mother used to sit in the house that was going to be mine, turning over the question of what it means to know something and stay quiet about it, and call that a choice made for principled reasons rather than comfortable ones. The question didn't have a clean answer. That was the part I was going to have to live with. The conversation happened 2 nights later in our apartment at the kitchen table we'd bought together 3 years ago from a shop that had since closed. I had chosen to wait those 2 nights deliberately. Not out of cruelty, and not because I needed more time to think I had been thinking for 18 months. I waited because I wanted the evening at my father's house to settle into something neither of us could re-narrate into a different shape. Events, while they're still warm, are easier to reframe. 2 days later, they've become what they were. Nicole came to the table with the composure of someone who has spent 2 days building an argument. She said she wanted to start by acknowledging the evening had been difficult. She said she understood that the family had concerns about her, that she'd perhaps not handled the dinner as well as she could have, and that she was willing to work on that if I could acknowledge that keeping something that significant from her for nearly 3 years had created a real problem in our communication. It was a sophisticated opening. It offered something that looked like accountability while simultaneously shifting the frame. By the time she finished the sentence, the question under consideration wasn't what she'd said at the table, but why I hadn't told her sooner. I said I'd like to come back to the communication question. But first I want to ask you something. She said, of course. I said, if you hadn't found out about the estate, if nothing had changed from Tuesday morning to now, would you still be thinking about what you said at the table? She said she wasn't sure she understood the question. I said, the apology I'm hearing tonight. Is it for what you said, or for what you said in front of people who turned out to be more relevant than you realized when you said it? The composure adjusted. The expression became more careful in a way that told me she was no longer running the prepared version. She said I was wrong to say what I said. I said, I know you believe that now. I'm asking whether you would believe it if tonight looked exactly like Wednesday morning. She didn't answer immediately. The silence that followed had the texture of a genuine attempt to be honest with herself, which was one of the things I had loved about her in the early years. She was capable of that in moments when the social performance wasn't required. I watched her sit with the question, and I thought about the first time I'd brought her to the house, how she'd asked my father about the trees my grandfather had planted, how the question had been real and not managed. That person was still in there somewhere. I wasn't sure anymore whether she was accessible to either of us. Nicole said, "I don't know." She said it quietly. She said, "I'd like to tell you that I've been building to that realization regardless. But I don't know if that's true. I think I've let some things get away from me. About how I talk about us. About what I expect." I said, "Tell me about that." She talked for a while. Not defensively, not with the prepared argument quality she'd come to the table with. She talked the way people talk when they've set down what they plan to say and are reaching for what's actually underneath it. She described the pressure she felt from the people she worked with and socialized with, the exhaustion of being around people who had more visible markers of success than us. The way she had translated that exhaustion into dissatisfaction rather than examining where it was actually coming from. She said she had started measuring things rather than experiencing them, and that she knew saying it out loud that it was a description of something that had gone wrong. I listened to all of it. Then I asked her the question I had been carrying since the night at the table. I said, "Do you love me, or do you love what I have?" The question landed and stayed in the air between us. She said, "Ethan, that's not..." I said, "It's the only question that matters right now. Everything else is downstream of it." She looked at the table. I watched her face do the thing it does when she's working through something real, not performing, working through something, the effort of genuine honesty. And I understood watching it that she didn't have a clean answer. Not because she was calculating, but because the question had found a place in her that wasn't fully mapped, and what lived there was more complicated than either version of the answer she could have offered. She said, "I think they've gotten tangled. What I feel for you and what I've started to expect. I think I confused the two and I made you pay for the confusion." That was the most honest thing she'd said to me in at least a year. I sat with it. It didn't fix anything. It didn't unsay what she'd said at the table or undo the 18 months of drift. But it was a real thing said by the real person who was somewhere inside all of it. I told her I appreciated her saying it. Then I told her it wasn't enough. Not to punish her. I want to be clear about that. I told her it wasn't enough because I had been watching for a long time, and what I had seen wasn't a single bad night or a single wrong choice. It was a pattern that had proceeded far enough that I couldn't look at Tuesday evening and call it an aberration. The woman who had told me to leave the room while my family watched had not arrived at that moment without practice. She had built to it over many months of smaller versions of the same thing. I didn't want to be married to the version of her that had been showing up. She asked if I was ending the marriage. I said I think we need to be honest with each other about whether there's a version of this that both of us actually want, that isn't based on what you now know about the estate. She said, "You're asking me to prove something." I said, "I'm asking both of us to be honest about whether the proof is there." The conversation continued for another hour, going around the question from different angles, the way long conversations do, when the central thing is too heavy to look at directly for too long. By the end of that night, nothing was decided. But something had shifted, not between us exactly, but in how clearly I could see the situation for what it was. What followed in the weeks after happened gradually and without spectacle. We spoke to a therapist separately first, and then together. It became clear across those sessions that the tangling Nicole had described between her feeling for me and her expectations of what a life with me should look like was not something that had come from nowhere, and was not something that was going to untangle quickly or easily. The therapist was honest about that. We filed the papers in late winter. The process was managed by attorneys and conducted without active hostility, which I credit to both of us deciding not to make it worse than it had to be. The settlement was uncomplicated. The family estate had always been held in trust and predated the marriage, so it was outside the scope of marital property. What Nicole received was a fair accounting of what we had actually built together, the equity in the apartment we'd shared, accounts that were genuinely joint things that were genuinely ours. Nothing more and nothing less. She moved to a neighborhood on the other side of the city. I heard through Lydia months later that she was doing well. Same job, different apartment, the rebuilt quality that people carry when they're starting something over. I didn't have any active feeling about that beyond something like the wish for her to become clearer about what she actually wanted, rather than what she'd been measuring herself against. I moved back to my father's house for a few months while the apartment was being sold. Lydia came by one afternoon in early spring. We sat in the kitchen with coffee at the table with the light coming through the window that looks out onto the yard where my grandfather's trees were doing what they do every year. She asked if I was okay. I said yes in the kind of way where okay doesn't mean everything is good, but means you can see where good might be from where you're standing. My father walked in from the garden and sat down and poured himself coffee. He looked at me for a moment and then said something he must have been thinking about for some time. He said, "Your grandfather used to say that the most valuable thing a man can leave behind isn't land or money. It's the clarity to know who deserves to be trusted with it." He picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the trees. He said he also used to say the harder part isn't deciding who deserves it. It's being honest with yourself when the answer is someone you were hoping it wasn't. I sat with that for a while. I was right. The secret that had cost me something wasn't the one my grandfather had required me to keep. It was the one I had chosen to keep, the one about what I could see and had been watching and had decided to hold rather than name, because naming it would require doing something about it. And doing something about it was harder than watching. My father finished his coffee and went back to the garden. Lydia stayed for another hour. We talked about other things. Her kids, a project I was working on the fence on the east side of the property that had been needing attention for 2 years. When she left, I sat alone at the table in the kitchen where my mother had sat every morning in the house my grandfather had built, which was now mine in the formal sense. It had always been mine in every other sense. Outside the window, the trees continued doing what they had always done. Some things you know before the document arrives. The lesson I was still learning was simpler and harder than the estate. The trust or anything my grandfather had put in writing the people worth knowing are the ones you'd still choose if there were nothing at stake. And the time to find that out is before you've already spent years hoping it's true. If that idea stayed with you today, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And subscribe if you want more stories like this one. There's always more where this came from.